Snow drifted lazily from a pale gray sky, falling in slow spirals over the quiet streets of Pine Ridge, Montana. The air bit at Claire Harding's cheeks as she pushed her wheelchair along the uneven wooden boardwalk that lined the main street. Her hands were numb on the metal rims, the leather gloves she wore doing little to keep out the cold. She had traveled over 1,000 miles from Kansas, answering a letter from a man who had promised her a home, a future, and perhaps even love. In her mind, she had pictured the two of them building a life together, filling evenings with conversation and mornings with shared coffee by the window. She had clung to that image for weeks on the rattling train, each mile bringing her closer to the man she believed would accept her as she was. Instead, the moment she rolled into Howard Grant's small ranch house, she saw his face tighten, his jaw clench. He had taken one long look at the chair, at her still legs covered by a wool blanket, and she could feel his disappointment like a physical weight. "You didn't say you were a broken bar like this," he muttered, his eyes flicking to the door as if to make sure no one saw. Claire's throat tightened. She wanted to remind him of the letters they'd exchanged, the words about kindness, faith, and starting over. She wanted to tell him she was more than this chair, that she could sew, cook, manage accounts, and tend to a home with more efficiency than many women who walked on two good legs. But the moment had already slipped away. His mind was made up. "I think a broken bar. I think it's best you find somewhere else to stay," he said, avoiding her gaze. The rejection stung more sharply than the icy wind outside. She didn't argue. Pride held her spine straight, even as her heart cracked. Gathering the small leather satchel she carried, she wheeled herself back down the ramp and into the street. Her breath rose in sharp clouds. She had no family here, no friends. The nearest inn would cost more than she could afford. For the first time since she left Kansas, the thought of returning crossed her mind, but the ticket home was far beyond her means, and even if it weren't, going back felt like a defeat she couldn't bear. She kept moving, the wooden planks beneath her wheels creaking with each turn. The town was small, just a scattering of storefronts, a general supply shop, a post office, and a saloon whose warm light spilled onto the snow. People glanced her way, their eyes skimming over her as if unsure whether to offer help or keep their distance. Claire was used to those looks. She turned the corner toward a quieter side street, hoping to gather her thoughts before deciding where to go. That's when she saw him. A tall man with broad shoulders emerged from between two buildings, carrying a stack of chopped firewood under one arm. His coat was old, patched at the elbows, and his hat was pulled low against the cold. His boots crunched through the snow, and each step seemed to carry a quiet strength. He might have passed by without a word, but when his eyes caught hers, something shifted in his expression. "Ma'am, you look like you could use a warm fire," he said. His voice was deep, steady, the kind that made you believe the words were meant exactly as they were spoken. Claire hesitated. "The broken bar. I'm fine," she replied automatically, though the trembling in her hands betrayed her. He set the wood down in a neat stack and stepped closer. "Snow's only going to get worse tonight. You'll freeze out here." He didn't look at her chair with pity. In fact, he hardly looked at it at all. His eyes stayed on hers, waiting for an answer. She swallowed hard, caught off guard by his directness. "I don't have anywhere to go," she admitted. The words felt heavier than she expected. "Then you come with me," he said simply, as though the matter were already decided. Every caution she had been taught about trusting strangers flickered in her mind, but there was no malice in his tone, no condescension. Just quiet certainty. He introduced himself as Elias Spoon, a mountain man who lived a few miles outside town. He didn't promise her comfort. In fact, he made it clear his place was small and rough, but it was warm, and it was safe. By the time they reached his cabin, the snow had thickened into a steady curtain, settling on the pine branches overhead. The cabin was a single room, with a stone fireplace on one side and a bed tucked into the corner under a heavy quilt. A small table sat by the window, worn smooth from years of use. It wasn't much, but it was clean, and the air smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. Elias set about building the fire higher, stacking logs until the flames licked at the chimney. He ladled steaming soup into a tin bowl and placed it on the table before her. "Ain't fancy," he said, "but it'll warm you through." She took a tentative sip. The broth was simple, with potatoes and carrots, but it was the best thing she'd tasted in days. "Thank you," she murmured. He sat across from her, his large hands wrapped around his own bowl. They didn't speak much at first. The crackle of the fire filled the space between them. But she noticed how he didn't rush her, didn't press for her story, didn't fill the air with meaningless chatter. When she finally told him about Howard Grant and the rejection that had left her in the snow, he didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell her she deserved better, though perhaps she could see he believed it. He only said, "Some folks don't have eyes to see what's right in front of them." It was a small thing, but it lodged in her heart. That night, Elias gave her the bed and laid out a blanket by the fire for himself. She protested, insisting he didn't need to do that, but he shook his head. "You've been out in the cold enough today." Lying under the quilt, listening to the wind whistle outside, Claire felt the tension in her shoulders ease for the first time in weeks. She wasn't Matilda Macron va, she knew this was only a temporary shelter, and that Elias had troubles of his own. But there was something in his manner, a quiet steadiness, that made her believe she might not be as alone as she thought. In the days that followed, she learned more about him. He had grown up in these mountains, the sons of a trapper and a schoolteacher, and had lived through more than one winter where food was scarce and snowdrifts climbed higher than the windows. He worked odd jobs for the townsfolk when he could, chopping wood, repairing fences, and hunted to fill the rest of his needs. He spoke little about his past, but she caught glimpses of loss in the pauses between his words. And slowly, without intending to, she began to settle into his rhythm. She helped where she could, peeling vegetables for stew, mending torn shirts with her practiced needle, keeping the cabin tidy. He never treated her work as less valuable because she couldn't chop wood or haul water. In fact, he seemed almost grateful for the quiet order she brought. One evening, as the fire cast flickering shadows on the walls, she caught him studying her. "What?" she asked, half smiling. He shrugged. "Just thinking how different this place feels since you came." The words warmed her more than the fire. She had come to Montana hoping to find a man who would see past her chair, but perhaps she had found something rare, a man who saw her without needing to look past anything at all. Outside, winter still gripped the mountains, but in that small cabin, something else was taking root. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of something she had thought she'd lost forever, the feeling that she truly belonged somewhere. The winter in the Montana mountains did not yield easily. Even in late March, snow clung stubbornly to the shaded slopes, and the nights still dropped low enough to make the air bite. In Elias Spoon's small cabin, however, the fire burned steady, and Claire found herself settling into a rhythm she never expected. Each morning she woke to the faint sound of Elias stoking the stove, the scent of wood smoke mingling with the sharp, clean air that seeped in through the chinks in the logs. Some mornings there was coffee, strong and black, and other mornings there was only hot water with a pinch of dried mint from a jar he kept tucked away. She learned quickly that Elias lived simply, not because he didn't want more, but because the mountains demanded it. Claire tried to make herself useful, even in ways she didn't think mattered. She mended the elbows of his worn work shirt, patched a tear in his coat, and kept the table swept clean. When the weather allowed, Elias would push her chair just outside to the porch so she could sit in the sun while he chopped wood nearby. She liked the sound of his axe striking the log, the sharp crack that echoed through the stillness. It was a rhythm, steady, certain, reassuring. They talked, but not all the time. Sometimes they sat in companionable silence, each busy with their own thoughts. Claire had never known a man who could be so comfortable without filling the air with noise. He didn't press her for her life story, though in bits and pieces she told him about Kansas, about her parents who had died too young, and about the accident that had taken her ability to walk. He listened without interruption, his gaze steady, his hand still as if to give her space for every word. One cold morning, when frost still silvered the window, Elias came back from town with a burlap sack slung over his shoulder. He set it down on the table, and when she opened it, she found flour, beans, and a small wedge of cheese. "Traded for it," he explained simply. Mr. Carter needed some repairs done on his barn. Claire realized then that Elias's life was held together by small acts of barter and hard work, each day's effort paying just enough to get them to the next. It wasn't an easy life, but it was honest. She had come to Montana believing her worth as a bride would be measured by her ability to keep a household and bear children. Howard Grant had made it clear he saw no value in her beyond the chair. But here, in Elias's cabin, she began to feel something she hadn't in a long time: necessary. One afternoon, when the clouds cleared and the sunlight poured like gold through the trees, Elias asked if she wanted to see the creek that ran behind the ridge. It was only a short distance from the cabin, but the snowmelt had turned the ground soft, and pushing the wheelchair through mud would be impossible. Without asking for permission, Elias crouched in front of her and, with careful strength, lifted her into his arms. She started to protest, but the words caught in her throat when she saw the look on his face. It wasn't pity. It wasn't burden. It was simply matter of fact, like carrying firewood or lifting a bucket of water, just another part of the day's work. He carried her down to the water's edge, where the creek ran clear and fast, sparkling under the sun. They sat there for a long time, her in the grass with her legs tucked under a blanket, Elias leaning back on his hands. The sound of the rushing water was like a song without words, and for a while, neither of them spoke. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was quiet. "You know I can't a broken bar give you the kind of life most women could." He didn't answer right away. He picked up a smooth stone and tossed it into the current, watching it vanish beneath the ripples. "I don't care about most women," he said. "And I don't care about the kind of life people say I should want. I care about these, about coming down to the creek on a sunny day and having someone to sit with." He glanced at her, his eyes warm but unwavering. "That's worth more to me than anything." Her chest tightened, and she turned her face toward the water so he wouldn't see the tears in her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not in Kansas, not on the long journey west, not even in the hopeful letters she had once received. Spring came slowly, as if testing the land before committing. The snow retreated from the meadows, revealing the first stubborn shoots of green. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. Elias began spending more time hunting and fishing, bringing home trout or the occasional rabbit. Claire learned to prepare each catch with care, making the most of every scrap. She even began experimenting with small improvements to the cabin, sewing curtains from spare fabric and arranging shelves for better storage. Elias noticed everything, though he never made a show of it. Sometimes she caught him watching her with a faint smile, as if seeing something he'd been searching for without knowing it. One evening, after a long day of repairing a neighbor's fence, Elias came home with something unexpected. It was a book worn at the edges, the cover faded from years of handling. "Found it at the trading post," he said. "Figured you might like it." She ran her fingers over the cover, recognizing it as a collection of poetry. "It's beautiful," she murmured. That night, by the fire, she read aloud to him. At first, she thought he was only humoring her, but as the pages turned, she realized he was listening intently, his gaze fixed on her rather than the flames. It struck her how strange and wonderful it was, to share words in a place where conversation was usually simple and direct. The more time they spent together, the more the unspoken began to weave between them. She noticed how he always made sure the path from her chair to the bed was clear, how he kept the fire burning higher when she seemed cold, how his voice softened when he spoke her name. He noticed how she leaned into the light when she laughed, how her eyes followed him when he worked, how she touched the quilt each night as if it were a small piece of home. By midsummer, the mountains were alive with wildflowers, and the air was warm enough to leave the cabin windows open at night. One afternoon, they walked, or rather, he carried Hera into a meadow he had never shown her before. The grass came up to his knees, and the air was thick with the scent of blooming lupine and paintbrush. He set her down gently on a blanket and sat beside her. "I wanted to bring you here," he said, "because this is where I'd like to marry you." Her breath caught. She hadn't dared imagine he might feel the same way she did, though in her heart she had been falling for him since the night he offered her his coat in the snow. "Elias," she began, "you know what people will say." He cut her off with a small shake of his head. "I've spent most of my life not caring what people say. Why would I start now?" The proposal wasn't grand, but it was perfect. In that meadow, surrounded by mountains that had stood for centuries, she said yes. They were married 2 weeks later, in the same spot, with only a handful of neighbors and the wind through the pines as witnesses. Elias wore his best shirt, and Claire wore a dress she had sewn herself from cream-colored fabric he had traded for in town. When he kissed her, it was gentle but sure, sealing a promise neither of them would break. Life didn't become easier after they wed. The cabin was still small, the winters still harsh, and the work never ending. But the difference was that now, they faced it together. Elias never treated her as fragile. Instead, he trusted her with decisions, asked for her opinion, and shared the weight of each day's challenges. She, in turn, gave him the steadiness and warmth of a true home, a place not just to live, but to belong. In the years to come, there would be storms that rattled the walls and lean months when they counted every meal. But there would also be mornings filled with laughter, evenings by the fire, and long summer days in the meadow where they had promised each other their lives. Claire had come to Montana as a mail-order bride, rejected for being too broken. Instead, she had found a man who saw her not as less, but as wholly, a man who understood that love wasn't about what you could give in the eyes of the world, but about what you gave to each other when no one was watching. And in that truth, she found everything she had ever wanted.